Hello.
Here.
Hello. I be heard?
Yeah, good job.
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
Start.
Madam Chair, this is a debate about half the world's population which are structurally barred from attaining an acceptable level of happiness in an inherently capitalistic world. This debate is about individuals in poverty, individuals who do not have enough, but to look at the question of their own subsistence every single day of their life. They're unable to find meaning in what they do because they are unable to get the basic minimum standards of things like food, water, and shelter that we think is paramount and necessary in order for you to first get that form of happiness. We side with the vulnerable, we side with the oppressed. We would progressively tax happiness and redistribute it to everyone in society. What is the setup coming from side of opening government? Number one, I think the fact that the motion states that we can accurately use technology to measure and transfer happiness means that we have a fiat over how effective this is going to be. The second thing to note is that progressive taxation of happiness means that the more happy an individual is, or the higher their propensity to be happy, we would tax more happiness and redistribute them to individuals who are most vulnerable and those individuals who find it hardest to attain happiness. So individuals in poverty who are currently in the status quo, unable to attain that happiness, will get the most happiness redistributed to them. We think this taxation will take place and it will help to alleviate everyone to a certain level of happiness in which we think that they can ascertain basic conditions in which they are happy. Right? We believe that this will enable the world's poor to no longer have to suffer every day, looking at the question of how they're going to continue on to the next day, how they're going to get food tomorrow. We think this is the closest approximation to equality in the status quo, and it's the exclusive methodology by which we can attain that. Right? I have one main argument in this speech today, right? And that's why happiness is derived on morally arbitrary means, and such a redistribution of happiness is principally necessary. Note, firstly, that this is going to be about the vast majority of instances and likelihood, right? So this is just a framing thing. So if opposition wants to come up here and say, well, this poor individual can gain happiness in, say, for example, reading a Bible or having happiness in interacting with family, we would point to you that this is deeply insufficient to proving their burden, because they have to prove on a likelihood why all of the most of these poor individuals who are currently locked out from happiness, can gain their benefit. We think this is a debate about the vast majority of instances in society. I'll take a POI at 6. Please don't POI right now. Okay. Number one, note, right, that the world in which we live is one that is inherently capitalistic and one that was unjustly acquired to begin with. What does this look like? We think that media portrayal and pop culture often fetishizes like things like wealth, right? We think that the culture normative force that is propagated by the media, for example, through things like Wolf of Wall Street, or the fact that in many movies, the poor individual is always infantilized, goes to show that they always believe in two things. Number one, that financial safety is necessary in order for you to gain happiness. But secondly, it's the idealization of materialism. So we get things like advertisements in the status quo. We get things like makeup telling you that in order to aspire to a certain level of happiness is to mean that you need this shade of lipstick, right? The importance of this is that many people are unable to access these forms of materials, which means that they are unable to garner that sort of happiness. But here's the thing, even if they are able to, they often feel that they are still not happy because they compare themselves to other individuals who have more wealth, who have more happiness, and therefore they still continue to remain in a perpetual state of unfulfillment. We think that inherently, because we live in a capitalistic world that prioritizes things like financial safety and fantasizes wealth, it's often very difficult for your poor individuals and vulnerable individuals to attain the same form of satisfaction with how life is, right? That means that these individuals are unable to live the same conditions of life. The reason why this is pernicious is because a lot of these idealized concepts of what happiness are manufactured. That means that they aren't actually true, but it's one in which media, like corporations, have propagated upon people. This is terrible because understand that a lot of these things like wealth, things like how things like that, like gaining property and stuff, were unjustly acquired to begin with. We do not think it is principally just in order for you to shackle poor individuals out from attaining happiness. But the second thing to note, right, is just purely on a biological basis, we think that individuals have a greater propensity for happiness than others. We don't exactly see why this is also something that is just. We would rather this be redistributed. The key thing to note here is that many people can subscribe to different conceptions of happiness. So some people can find happiness in, for example, wearing lipstick. Some people can have it in debating. But the commonality in all these instances is that you first need a degree of wealth in order to subscribe into these different conceptions of happiness. That's where we think is exclusively why we would redistribute happiness on the outside of the house. But before I continue.
Taken.
Can't hear. Can't hear. Can't hear.
Okay, never mind. So now, right, what do we think we change on the outside of the house? Because note that in the status quo, this is a world in which the vast majority of individuals are unable to ascertain happiness. So this looks like things like poor individuals, right? But it also looks like middle income individuals who are currently fighting in 9-to-5 jobs that even though they do not like it, they're only fighting for it to earn some money. What are the outcomes of this, right? We think that for the vast majority of individuals in the current status quo, they live without a sense of self-worth or dignity, right? Because understand that every time they try and achieve something, because they're structurally barred out from achieving the sort of wealth that we think is necessary for happiness on the outside of the house, that means that the vast majority of people are going to feel like a deep sense of lack of dignity. They are unable to live in a certain form of happiness that we think everyone deserves. But what Wee-Ern is going to exclusively tell you in our speech is why exactly this is so important. Because understand, at a point at which we have a closer approximation to equality and more individuals in the net are closer to happiness, we think you get things like less crime, less theft, where currently theft and crime and these sorts of things are propagated by the vast majority, like most crimes are created by crimes of necessity, which changes on this outside of the house. So not only do we have a principled justification for this policy, but we're going to explain to you why exactly this is practically the best thing to do. For all those reasons, we side with the poor and vulnerable. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for the Prime Minister. Welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Hear, hear.
Start.
Just at the top of this debate, I would like to clarify that this is a debate about happiness. This is not Bosio's debate on the Marxist revolution. The problem with opening government's case today is that they assume wealth is a proxy for happiness. So if their entire problem is that this world has massive inequality in wealth, and that is leading to massive dissatisfaction, unhappiness, depression, then we are okay with redistributing wealth. What we think should not be redistributed is happiness. So let's be very clear. The bulk of that Prime Minister's speech is already off the table. Because as far as we can do wealth redistribution on the side of opposition, then OG's case is irrelevant because he bases the entire assumption of what people's happiness is on wealth. But let's just deal with his argument anyways. He says that there are many reasons, for instance, media portrayal, circumstances that poor people are in, that leads to dissatisfaction and unhappiness. Actually, that is a very elitist view of the way that poor people lead their life. I think it's just elitist for him to assume that poor people just wade around life every single day with no meaning and feel depressed. actually that's not the case. The truth is the vast majority of poor people find satisfaction elsewhere. It be in religion, may it be in their own families. In fact, poor people around the world are found to be much happier than many individuals who are wealthier than them. We give you a good example of this. Bhutan, who frequently ranks as one of the happiest countries in the world, they're impoverished. Their people there suffer on what is below the minimum wage of the rest of the world while they live in poor standards of living. But yet, individuals there are still able to find happiness. What is the significance of all of this analysis? The significance is that individuals who are poor are still able to seek happiness. But if they are not able to seek happiness, as OG would like to claim, then we are fine in redistributing wealth. So with that, I move to the two arguments that we're going to forward to you today. The first is on a principled grounds. Why is it that the state cannot redistribute happiness away or towards you? And secondly, on why is it that on net, we make individuals happier? First argument, principle. Why is it the state cannot take away your happiness? Recognize individuals have a right to their happiness. Why is it so? Because when do we think something is good? Is something is only good because people have identified it and gave it value? We always act in our own self-interest. We think that people have a right not to be tortured. We think they have a right to self-defense. But recognize that all of these interests of human beings and all our rights stem from one thing, which is the human dignity and the happiness that we derive. It is precisely because happiness is such a basal emotion that individuals are entitled to it, that they should not be forced to give it up when the state comes knocking. This is fundamental and innate to you as an individual, and the state cannot take it away from you. But recognize that this act itself, assuming the state is just giving you happiness, isn't taking away from you, it's a terrible infringement of your autonomy. It is using humans purely as a means to an end. We give you a good example. Scientists have already found a way of making people happier by just injecting chemicals straight into their heads. But I think everyone in this room today will agree that is a horrible idea, because the state should not have the power to control something so basal and emotional about me as a human being. Furthermore, we tell you that happiness in of itself has no meaning. Happiness, the meaning behind happiness is often tied to actions. So another good example of this is the experience machine, a philosophical question that we have all probably encountered in debates before. The importance here is this: happiness is just a byproduct of things that are real, things that we experience every single day. For instance, achieving our goals, or just being able to wake up and feel satisfied about the state of life that we have. But if you take away these things and you just objectify happiness as the one goal in life and then redistribute it to all these individuals, happiness loses its meaning. Happiness is only meaningful to individuals the moment it's tied to an action, something that they are able to do, something they are able to attain, and something they are able to reap happiness directly from. Why is this analysis valuable? All this analysis is valuable because it justifies to you that the state does not have the right to take happiness away from you or to just inject it into you against your own free will because of this policy of mass redistribution of happiness. Now, I'd like to note that the only possible OG rebuttal to this, as they hinted in PM, is about how, it's arbitrary and therefore the state has the right to take it away from you. No, just because something is arbitrary does not mean the state has the right to take it away from you. In fact, we tell you that many individuals who derive their happiness don't do so through artificial means. They arbitrary means, but rather gained it through legitimate means such as working hard towards their goals. But why is it that arbitrariness doesn't mean they can take it away from you? We give you a good example. For instance, you having a child is arbitrary, but it doesn't mean that the state can just take this child away from you, because it recognizes that you as a parent have a strong relationship to this child, and that outweighs anything that the state is able to do. Second argument here on the practical, how we allow for happier individuals. There are 4 tiers. The first is that you are no longer able to feel satisfaction on the side of opening government. Recognize they assume that just because they redistributed happiness and everyone exists at a basal level, that everyone is happy. No, that need not be the case. You could be at basal level where everyone is miserable. We contend to you that actually happiness is only meaningful because there's an up and down cycle. Sometimes you feel sad, sometimes you feel happy. And only then do you truly experience satisfaction. This does not happen on the side of government, because they are forcing individuals to tend towards a mean. And because everyone is fixed at that mean, they are unable to achieve true satisfaction from their happiness. The second is that there is no motivation to achieve happiness anymore. And we tell you this motivation is what precisely drives individuals. For instance, the process itself, working towards your goal, could make individuals happy because they achieve a lot of short-term goals along the way. Or once you reach your long-term goal, be it a dream job, getting married, having children, all of this allows individuals to self-actualize and achieve happiness. Recognize this means on our side, net happiness increases, and it increases for every single individual, even those who have to adjust their expectations of life to be content with life. And that is exactly what the poor do, right? They don't just live the rest of their life miserably. This is a third tier. This brings me to the third and final tier of this argument about how they force on proposition everyone to become agents of the state. Where the state is able to control your most basal emotion, and where the state is able to impose happiness on you. All this leads to less satisfied individuals because even if you're angry at the state, they feel beholden to it now. They have such immense power over something so innate and internal within us. For all these reasons and more, very proud to stand with opening opposition.
Thank you for that, Leader of Opposition. We now welcome the DPM to give their speech.
The elitist arrogance of side opposition disgusts me. When they say you can only achieve happiness when you have a cycle of sadness and a cycle of happiness, I ask you, how are individuals who are clinically depressed, who are mentally ill, who are so poor to the point where they don't feel anything but to always simply question their literal subsistence, that the world has nothing in it for them? How do you save these individuals on your side of the house? We literally preempted this entire mitigation about how they can derive it from religion. A lot of individuals don't. In the vast majority of instances, they end up doing things like suicide because, as we need to, as I will prove in my speech, happiness is a prerequisite to action. That happiness allows you to create self-identity, and think about what you actually want to do with life. All those rebuttals will be integrated with argumentations later on. The first, I'll take out the strategy coming from opening opposition in this debate. Number one, note their literal lack of counter mechanism at all. What does this mean? This means they're going to continue letting a lot of individuals suffer from a lot of harm due to the lack of happiness. But then they say, oh, we can simply tax wealth. Two things. Number one, the taxation of wealth oftentimes doesn't have as much wealth capital. I think both sides to operate in a world in which this debate happens in status quo, which means in a world in which taxation of wealth isn't as efficient as possible and welfare isn't as efficient as possible. How do we let society be as productive or be as happy or to access the basic right of happiness, which I'll prove later on in my speech? But second, note specifically that they did not deal with the counter, they gave zero analysis on how they counter our framing. We told you this debate is about individuals who are truly unhappy with their lives and have no ability to access their own identity because every single day they cannot think. They can only think about how the world has nothing for them and how they don't even need to exist. These are individuals in which opposition did not want to deal with at all. They say some individuals feel as though their happiness is robbed from the state. John told you why your happiness is found on morally arbitrary reasons anyway, and for these specific individuals, we are happy to take the trade-off. Even if a rich individual, a moderate income individual can find happiness in like your family, for example, we would take it away to an extent so an individual who has no happiness at all in life is able to feel a sense of motivation to even live in this current society. We think the harm of the impact, we think the moral harm actually stands on opposition. If we prove that it's principally justified by proving happiness is actually a fundamental human right and has been the premise of international laws, of every single political structure, of policies as a whole, and how this was the ultimate goal of governments, we think it was justified in having a state tax on happiness. Number one, two arguments in the speech. Why is happiness a principal human right as a whole? We would argue to you that happiness is actually a gateway right and has been the foundational premise in which all international laws and government policies have been built upon. The function of human existence is literally to be able to feel happy, because only when you're happy, you're able to have the self-identity in which you want, which means only when you're happy and you're free to think about things other than things which are depressing, like how you're unable to access anything in this world, are you able to talk about what you actually like to do? Are you actually able, only then are you able to talk about what you actually derive happiness from. We would draw a parallel comparative to individuals who are working in 9-to-5 jobs in which they don't enjoy because they are not because they don't have happiness at all in these circumstances. They simply aren't even able to think about what actually gives them satisfaction inside. We think that comes better on our side of the house. So thereby, why is happiness a principal gateway right to a lot of things in society, right? Happiness is the prerequisite to being able to determine your own self-will, and this is the primary comparative in which we're going to draw in this debate. The function of a law on things like stopping crime, for example, is because we recognize that if you rob an individual and they lose things, they lose happiness in the society. We think the general function of government policies when it comes towards things like welfare, redistribution, for example, all these argumentations or all these government policies are meant to improve, like literally improve or to maximize the ability of individuals on the ground to feel happy. Why is being happy something that's important to a state as a whole? Two things. It improves the general productivity of individuals when it comes to contributing to a society. We think if you're able to feel happy with your job, you're more likely to do well. We think the cross studies that prove this are things like how a lot of corporations focus on creating work from home environments or work environments that are extremely casual because only then individuals feel less stressed, are able to feel happy and thereby are more productive. It's closing opposition having a clarification.
Taken.
Can you clarify how this system actually works? That is, does your happiness just automatically get taken away once you've reached a certain threshold? And do the different types of happiness that exist, like pleasure, satisfaction, pride, or fulfillment, all just translate into one type of happiness? It's very unclear.
All right. So what we are going to do is things like progressive taxation in first world countries when it comes to taxing corporations. So if you have a large amount of happiness, we think we would take a huge percentage from you. We think we would draw parallel analysis to things like tax brackets, for example, and as to who we're going to give it to, these are individuals who literally, on the vast majority of cases, don't have any happiness at all. So these individuals who are literally like mentally ill, depressed, these are individuals who only can receive benefits and receive an immediate impact on their way of life, on their quality of life, under government's policy, we're able to redistribute it towards their needs. We think that's how we're going to run on. As for secondly, on the idea of how satisfaction and happiness is actually different, we think it's kind of similar to an extent. But if the vast majority of happiness comes from like satisfaction, and the accumulation of that is something that we can measure, we're happily willing to tax that as well. Secondly, how are we able to functionally provide state as a right to do this? Number one, the principal justification that was completely unresponded to was our happiness in society is literally derived from morally arbitrary reasons. This is also beyond things like wealth, right? This is also specifically for individuals who don't have access to things like to think about happiness at all when they're depressed in the status quo. But they cannot fiat out debate on how wealth is the primary reason why a lot of individuals can derive happiness and how a lot of individuals who have access to wealth were unable to derive happiness at all. Noting that wealth is heavily arbitrary and unfounded, i.e. your skill sets are something that might not be relevant in some societies, but might be relevant in other societies, is something that's arbitrary, and we think the foundation of that is something that isn't good. But not specifically, we're not taking everything away from you. We're taking the access in which you have, the access in which you're willing to say that you don't necessarily need, and transfer over to individuals who currently don't have access to it at all. What is specific benefits of this? When it comes towards lowering crime rates, individuals who are currently depressed or who are currently like living in a state of poverty or like literally having to use crime of necessity as a way to sustain themselves, these are individuals who are going to be helped on our side of the house. That when they feel happy, they don't feel the need to do these things, and we say that is directly linked to happiness. Secondly, on our side of the house, we principally support a state intervention on this. We say that when there's an overarching harm of not helping individuals who are heavily desperate in society, and how there's an overarching benefit towards general society whole, as when it comes towards improving productivity of a nation, we are happily willing to tax happiness as something that we view as a human right.
Thank you very much, DPM. DLO.
Hi, can everyone hear me like this?
I can hear you.
Here.
Can everyone hear me like this?
Yes.
Start.
I want everybody in this room to take a step back from the bluster of OG's case and think about how this debate will actually play out in the real world. Imagine if they had this technology and this method of redistribution in the period of slavery in the United States. Under their side of the house, what they will be able to do is that every single African American slave would have been satisfied contended with their lot in life, and we probably would not have been able to get the change that we did. Think about the fact if this was implemented in Nazi Germany, and how easily Hitler would have gotten his goals if you were able to get every happy Jewish person into the concentration camps that both sides reviled in this debate. At the end of the day, I think it is unfair, unjust, and principally unjustified for you to send and put the happiness of every individual within the hands of the most oppressive and obscene actor, which is the state. The very fact that their side refused to clash with a whole minute of Kenneth's analysis
Point.
about how their side was unfair in allowing these individuals to be reliant on the state shows that their side is a team in retreat, not a team that was willing to engage. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. One, I want to talk about principle and show you what actually Kenneth's responses
Point.
already dealt with a bulk of their case, and I'm going to give additional refutation here. Secondly, I'm going to talk about which side makes people happier. Finally, I'm going to give you a substantive argument about empathy and why even we take their side on their best case, which is that we should make people happier on both sides of the house. I explained to you why on their side people become less happy over time. So firstly, let's talk about the principle. Note that their side actually bases a huge part of that principle on the idea that the world is divided by class, and happy people are those that are rich and those that are poor are oftentimes the saddest. Note that their side cannot simply say this is the world that this debate has to take place in, because insofar as their side is able to implement their policy, we tell that in the status quo, we have already implemented many of the policies which have helped uplift the poor and prevent the richest people from gaining all the power. The fact is that on that side of the house, we also have a symmetrical fiat to implement many of the things that we told you about. Do not let DPM get away by saying that this is an unjust overreach of our burden. Their side gives you two principles. The first is that happiness was gained arbitrarily. DPM asserts that we did not respond to this, but we actually did in Kenneth. We told you that the fact is that just because something is arbitrary does not mean it should be taken away. For instance, I might have a daughter, and the fact that I have my daughter is arbitrary because I did not choose to have that particular daughter. Yet the fact is, the state does not take away my child from me simply because of the fact that it came about by arbitrary circumstances, and the fact is that that child is arbitrary and should not even be mine to begin with. I don't think there's given us sufficient analysis to show why something is arbitrary equals bad. Secondly, I don't think that happiness is actually arbitrary at all. This is simply a cut and paste argument that can be applied to almost every single debate, right, about taxation. Just think about it. Most of the time, our happiness is earned. We don't feel happy just because I say win a debate competition. We often only feel happy because we put in effort, we put in blood and soil and tears, and that is why we actually feel any amount of satisfaction at all upon that point of victory. I don't think it's fair to say that all happiness is simply the result of some kind of wealth or all of these kinds of arbitrary factors in life, because sometimes it is within our control to make many of these decisions that influence our happiness. I want to point out the fact that that they have chosen not to respond to our entire principle. Our entire principle is one of the most important contributions in this debate, because what we told you is that fundamentally immoral and unjust for a state, which is already a violent and oppressive actor, to go into the minds of individuals. The fact is that on that side of the house, they will quell most of the oppressive regimes in the status quo, because they will simply make everybody happy and satisfied. This is literally every dictator around the world, from China to Turkey to Mexico. This is the dream that they've always sought for the rest of their days. Secondly, note that it also works the fundamental nature of the state and the human being, because under their side of the house, it simply doesn't, the people are simply reliant on their happiness upon the government. They cannot simply exit this taxation system and choose to pursue their happiness elsewhere. Their side arbitrarily caps the amount of happiness that people get. The fact that their side says that happiness is a gateway right precisely shows this point, because if it is a gateway right, it should not be arbitrarily restricted under their side of the house. Their side's only response to this came in the dying moments of DPM, where they said, if there's overarching harm, we can have the ability to infringe upon this human right. Here's the thing, simply because I want to do the weighing here. Some happiness should not overweigh all of these harms that we already told you in Canada that were unresponded to. At the end of the day, we take the principle clash because we were the side that proved that we were able to ensure that individuals were not subject to the oppressive and violent power of the state. I'll say open.
Happiness is morally arbitrary due to your birth lottery. We literally told you how minorities who are Hispanics, minorities who are black are unable to access it even on a minimum level. The only reason why there was a movement in America was because individuals were happy enough to want more. People don't fight in movements because they don't even feel happy enough, and they question their subsistence on your side of the house. How do you help these specifically vulnerable individuals?
I think it is elitist and is frankly very very wrong and very undecipherable for their side to say that every poor individual is unhappy. The fact is, if African Americans were so unhappy, the fact is most of them are still alive. The fact is that most of them have not committed suicide or gone into some kind of moral depression or angst about their own lived condition. I think it's extremely unfair and it's just bad debating for them to say that all of them are unhappy and cast all of them in one certain light when they clearly aren't. I'm also going to talk to you about how under outside of the house, we make people happier. Here's the thing, that's I chose not to respond to what Kenneth told you about how some people are born up, about how we can only gain satisfaction and happiness through a process. So oftentimes, it is the low points that make our high points seem meaningful. If all our lives were simply just a compendium of happy experiences, those people would not be happy. The fact is, there are many rich people who stay rich, and the fact is, because there's no tangible change within their lives, there is no change in their happiness. It's only on outside the house where these people are able to gain happiness, because on their side, all the painful and experiences are eliminated when everybody is just cast down to the same level playing field. Finally, I want to talk about the substantive material that I have today. It's about how on their side of the house, they eliminate empathy completely. Happiness is not simply a process by which you take away one unit from a person and you give it to another. Happiness is not static because happiness tends to expand. For instance, if I help you in a certain deed, through a certain deed, we might both gain one unit of happiness. So it shows that happiness is never static in this situation. Under their side, there would be no empathy within human society because every individual will be part to the same level of happiness and people feel no moral need to help others. What this necessarily means is that the level of happiness under their side of the house will likely remain restricted over time because there is no way that happiness can grow, there is no way that happiness can reach out to more individuals. At the end of the day, it is outside that is principle that is just, that prevents government from taking over the lives and emotions of people.
Thank you very much for that. We welcome the Member of Government.
Hello, can I be heard? Am I audible by everyone?
Yes, you are.
All right, thanks.
Here.
Panel. Closing government invites you to envision a world where people are more empathetic and where there is more reason and a direct tie between the majority and the minority, where there is a tie between your happiness and the people around you. We think that is the ideal world and we're going to demonstrate how we get to it. There was a lot of unclarity and just disunity in top half as to what this debate ought to be about. So before I get into my extensions, I want to make a few key clarifications. The first is that this is a progressive tax. It's not like the state is taking away all of your happiness till you reach this strange neutral level that they want to discuss. That means you're still going to have a level of happiness that you can keep for yourself, but a part of that happiness will be redistributed. We'll explain why that's justified later on, where we talk about how there's a diminishing marginal utility to happiness in the first place. The second thing we'd like to address is this question to CEO. They say that, oh, happiness is a vague thing. There are many forms of happiness. Are you going to clump them all together in one? Presumably, that's what the motion asks us to do, but we'd also say that it's not the most relevant discussion in this debate, because I think if the strategy is just to blur what happiness is and blur the forms of happiness that exist, it's probably not a good strategy. It probably makes the entirety of the debate undebatable. Right. A few discussions in this speech. The first will be expanding on the principle, and I'll show you how we trump the discussion from opening. The second is a discussion of our counterfactual, what we think the world is going to look like and how we think we get to a more empathetic world. First discussion then, all responses are integrated. First discussion then on principle. There's this back and forth in opening government and opening opposition of accusations of elitism, of whether or not happiness is arbitrary and whether or not that means anything, whether or not happiness is something sacred. We say, look, this is all irrelevant to the question of the debate. I think it's value neutral at best. What we'd introduce is that fundamentally, if we treat happiness as a commodity, there is a diminishing marginal utility to happiness. That's to say, past a certain point, having more happiness does not make you any more productive, does not make you any more fulfilled with your life. Furthermore, we say people fundamentally operate on hedonic treadmills. They operate based on what they consider the norm. So the further and further they go from that norm, they're alienated from that happiness. They can't comprehend that it makes them far more happy than as if they were closer to the norm. So there is a diminishing marginal utility to happiness. So what we think that means then is that fundamentally it's justified that we take it away from people who derive less utility from it and give it to people who derive more utility from it. If a rich person is slightly more happy by getting an extra dollar, but that dollar might feed a person, we redistribute that wealth. We think the same principle applies to happiness, where if a very happy person is only marginally more happy by gaining an extra unit of happiness, happiness, but a depressed person would gain so much more fulfillment and would maybe stop an attempt at suicide by being slightly happier, we think that's fundamentally justified on a principled level. The second layer here I'd add is, unlike what opening government claims, it's not just all about wealth. We know they tried to correct this in 6 minutes, but we think it's rather unclear and up to this point. We think the point of arbitrary advantages and the reason that argument is important, the reason that you have to credit CG for, is that fundamentally, in many instances, your happiness is derived from taking away happiness from other people. That's the reason why capitalism is quote unquote evil in their frame. It's because you, the capitalist pig or the head of the company, has directly derived happiness from making the lives of the people on the ground worse. We think that's the fundamental injustice that we seek to correct. And we point out that it's not just limited to wealth. It also exists in things like stereotypes, in things like bullying, in things like systematic racism, where the oppressor often feels like they're better just because they can oppress another person. It makes them happier. Then we deal with this claim from opposition that happiness is sacred. The state never has time to mess with your mind and choose what you can think. I think this is ludicrous. If I'm a murderer and I derive happiness from murdering, I think it's very justified that the state ought to stop me from murdering. Anyways, I don't think there's like this inflexible value that the state can never mess with. This is just ridiculous coming from their side of the house. Notice they also support things like wealth redistribution anyways. So if they're not okay with the state ever messing with people's happiness, why don't you allow people to accumulate more wealth if that's what gives them happiness? It's deeply unclear. I think this principle is out of the debate. Then they say, everyone will be miserable because you're taking away their happiness. No, I think it's going to be more equitable. I don't think you're immediately miserable just because you're marginally less happy. This is still unclear. Second discussion, but before that, I'll take a POI.
Taken.
Wouldn't you say that someone who is used to being very happy and is very happy by nature will feel the loss of a relatively small amount of happiness more than a person who is used to not being particularly happy, and therefore it is unfair?
First, I don't think that's true. I don't think that you can prove that within a framework of decent logic. But the thing I'd say to that, secondly, is if that person is happy by nature, that also means that person can regain their happiness faster. They have more means, more avenues to regain that same happiness. It might be that they have a better support group, a better job, a better avenue for deriving meaning as opening opposition provides. That means that their happiness is more sustainable than the person at the point who is depressed, who cannot find any other form of happiness. So we still think it's justified. Second, then, what do we think our world looks like? We think in our world, we give people the incentive to make other people happier because their happiness is directly tied to the happiness of people around them. The base level and the net happiness that opening opposition wanted to champion is only effective and only has a real impact when people can feel the net happiness of the people surrounding them. Otherwise, people are selfish. People are only incentivized to care about themselves. This is also where I deal with the claim coming from DLO that suddenly people will no longer strike out against the system, that the Nazis will remain in power. I don't think this is true. If the German people could feel the extreme unhappiness that Hitler was causing upon the Jews, I think it would give them more reason to strike out against the system, to notice and to feel directly empathetic for the harms that the state is causing against people. And notice that this is uniquely better than all other forms of social reform because it's direct. We don't have to explain how people are suffering structurally. People directly feel the consequences of abuse. People directly feel the consequences of discrimination. Three outcomes of this. First, we make people more cooperative. Because people care about each other more, they're more likely to not pursue in things that make other people unhappy because they realize that their actions will have consequences towards them. Second, we think we're far more likely to get faster social action on our side. And third, even if that doesn't happen, we think we're likely to have fewer unhappy people simply by the fact that we redistribute happiness. Then they might say, what if people become complacent? What if for some reason people once they meet a certain minimum level of happiness, they're no longer incentivized to seek further forms of happiness? One, we don't think this is automatically true in all instances. I think there's still probably some incentive to try to be slightly happier. But second, we think that's fine. Because then your incentive is to try to make other people happier so that you can maintain a stability in your own level of happiness. Your incentive at that point is to try to correct all forms of unhappiness that exist in the world so you can maintain your current satisfied level. Look, we think when it comes down to having a better world, in a world where more people are more empathetic, we're proud to propose.
Thank you for that. Welcome the Member of Opposition.
Hello, is everyone able to hear me?
Here, 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 here.
Start.
Happiness is an abstract concept and it only exists because of its inherent relativity. That is to say, you only feel happiness because there is a frame of reference, whereas for the most part of your existence, you are not feeling particularly happy. At the point where happiness now becomes, I suppose, a tradable commodity, that does a few things. Firstly, it makes people massively apathetic to the terrible conditions that they might be living in, which is something that opening only briefly discusses. But secondly, it means people stop seeking out happiness because they no longer get fulfillment for it. Because once that happiness crosses a certain threshold, they know it will just be taken away from them. And no, it is untrue that people will only be motivated then to still seek happiness because now they can know that they're giving that happiness to other people. But note that the only reason you'd ever want to give it to other people is because of the innate sense of fulfillment that you would feel at the point where you're making happiness for other people. But even that fulfillment is something that is liable for being taxed. At the point where you now make happiness a tradable commodity, you make life itself meaningless, an awful existence, absolutely devoid of emotion. This was obviously something we should not do. 4 things that are unique extensions from closing opposition. Firstly, further characterization of this debate, which opening does an awful job of, that is both sides of the opening house. Secondly, why global happiness is eroded. Thirdly, why social dynamics will be harmed. And fourthly, quickly, on the most vulnerable people. Firstly, in terms of characterization, and we even seek to clarify this with the opening government, but they do such a poor job and keep just saying, we will tax people in richer countries or whatever. No, we're specifically talking about how does this tax operate? That is, when you start feeling like, say, 90% happy, does the government suddenly just kick in and take that happiness? And is that automatically transferred to the person who is feeling most unhappy at the moment? The lack of clarity there was something that burdened opening government in particular. But even when they say, well, we're just going to tax what that looks like. And this is problematic for 2 reasons. Can people not hear me?
Here,
Am I
here.
being heard?
Here, here.
Okay. This is problematic for 2 reasons. The first reason is that there are different types of happiness. That is to say, you can feel pleasure or intimacy with a partner. That makes you happy. But you can also feel happy to the extent that you just watch like a shit comedy video on Netflix, for example, and consequently you derive pleasure from that. But that pleasure isn't something that's innately fulfilling to you. It was unclear on the government side whether that happiness was something that was directly transferable. To their credit, only closing government deals with this and says, no, this can all be transferred into one form of happiness. Unfortunately for them, that was particularly devastating to the world because it meant people started to drift through a meaningless void because you would no longer have any reason to seek out the things that make you most pleasurable, the things that are most specifically fulfilling to human beings, because you can instead just watch a YouTube video that makes you feel a requisite level of happiness such that the government is not going to take your happiness away. And that would be the sources that people go to, and only people then can at one point be only moderately happy. But the second thing to note as to why it was particularly devastating, the lack of clarity that came from opening government, was because happiness was just a relative construct. Firstly, because it's a positive departure from the norm, which our opening discusses briefly. But secondly, happiness is also a relative concept between people. That is to say, poor people might find happiness in just getting like a bowl of rice, whereas a rich person would be deeply indifferent to it. It was unclear how happiness could be transferred in those ways. That was something that opening government specifically failed to do. That's why they should fall out of this debate. But the second thing I want to talk about, and the major crux of this closing opposition extension, is why you erode global happiness in the long term. I think the first thing to note here is that people aren't all identical. That is to say that some people are being used to just being happy 85% of the time, say. There are naturally happy people in this world. There are those who are naturally unhappy. We think you disproportionately hurt those people because, not as the closing government seems to suggest you can't just look at the utility of happiness individuals get in the same way that you can't tax the utility of wealth people feel. Rather, you can only do such in raw numbers. But even if you said you could tax the utility of the happiness of people, note that your utility of happiness changes every day depending on circumstances, meaning it became such an amorphous concept. It was probably more likely you only take happiness as a broad construct, meaning that you disproportionately target certain people who are naturally happy. Their response to this is pitiful because they say, well, if you're naturally happy, then you can regain that happiness. Okay, you regain it, and then it is taxed away from you again, so you're never truly happy. Those people are disproportionately impacted. The second thing I want to talk about is the long-term implementation of this policy, because even if we believe that this will be something that will benefit certain people, even though it won't, even if you think it will benefit certain people, note that this is a system that trends towards zero, where there is just no longer any form of happiness in the world. That is for the mechanistic reason I provided you earlier. That is, you no longer seek things that will make you truly happy, because you note that those things that will make you truly happy or put you at like a 120% happiness level will not be something that you can inherently feel, because that is something that the government will impinge upon and take that happiness away. Instead, you will go by it and do menial things that make you amused to a requisite level, whereby, you know, it's below the threshold in which the government does. That means humans become soulless automatons that seek fleeting glimpses of pleasure, like amusing. They don't do that which is inherently satisfying to them, because it would otherwise be taken from them. In a world where people were just moderately happy at best, obviously the massive excesses of happiness that you had in the first place that you could tax from people eventually start disappearing, meaning that eventually there's just so little happiness such that your policy only works for a 20-year period, say. Finally, this contributes to a meaningless existence under why global happiness is eroded, because even when you're like proposed to, for example, when you're about to get married, you don't feel excessively happy there. And note that it's the excessive happiness that you remember in your life. I can remember times in my life where I've been massively happy, but I can remember very few moments where I've just been moderately happy, meaning that I don't even have a frame of reference now from which I learn from. But moreover, people just don't learn in the first place, because people no longer feel things like guilt or remorse or empathy. That meant life was meaningless. I'm going to take over.
Taken. This debate is a comparative. While it's not their fault that some people are naturally happy, it's also not the fault of individuals who are naturally unhappy, panel. What is closing opposition doing to address the fact that some people are depressed and there's nothing they can do to fix it on your side of the house?
If you are naturally unhappy and you are still alive, that probably means you have measures by which you cope with that unhappiness, but moreover, there are alternative mechanisms you can explore to make those people more happy. This gets onto analysis as to the most vulnerable people. Note that this is the actor in which government wanted to stake their main claim on, and they talked about how these people were living in subsistence, but functionally, you don't put food on the table of those people. Instead, you make them happy about the fact that they have no food. You make them happy when a policeman wrongfully shoots your son. And Olo briefly covers this, but we'll uniquely provide the mechanisms here, insofar as we say, firstly, you breed apathy in those groups and they won't then advocate for change, but secondly, you remove the sympathy that others will feel. So those people are placated, whereas you don't change mortality rates. That's why OG comes last. Fourth thing I want to talk about really quickly is social dynamics. I think firstly, this placates those who have legitimate reasons to be sad. That's particularly consequential in circumstances like domestic violence, for example. Secondly, it prevents character development because you don't feel guilty about things that you've done, because that's associated with sadness. Thirdly, it dissipates justified happiness in such a weird way, like you're no longer happy when you're proposed to. And fourthly, people lose other emotions, like their fear or the guilt or remorse they feel. That lowers their inhibitions. That further contributes to making life meaningless. Making life meaningless and removing a frame of reference was obviously something we should not do. We would prefer to live in a world of the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. Welcome to Government Whip.
Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Here.
I can hear you.
Okay. Let me just fix my papers. Sorry.
Start.
Ask 3 questions in the speech. But first, let's knock CO out of the debate. The premise of their case is, now you have no frame of reference for what true happiness, for happiness, and people will not be happy. Let's be clear. 1, I just like to point out that they lack the standard as to what true happiness really meant. Presumably, implicitly from their arguments, it was this idea that long-term happiness is real happiness. Then they said, people now have no reason to seek out things that make you happy in the long term because all happiness just gets transmuted into one sort of happiness. Guys, this is a mechanistic quibble that is not inherent to the motion. Like, obviously, if that's the case, then presumably we would argue that instead of making it into one big form of happiness, then you transmute long-term happiness and short-term happiness separately. None of their argumentation that was based on this premise was actually inherent to the motion, and so for that reason, all of their arguments that were premised on the idea that have to transmute all forms of happiness into one big sort of happiness fall out of the debate. Second, then they say that this disproportionately affects happy people because you will continue to take away their happiness more. One, note that if it is true, and they conceded this from Toby's speech, that these individuals regain their happiness faster, then that also means that you removing their happiness has a lesser harm onto them because they will regain it faster. But second, note they then say, but now you will remove all the happiness until these people become shells and unable to be happy. One, like there was no analysis as to how this ever happens, considering that we gave you a clarification from MG that this probably isn't a debate about removing all happiness from people who are happy. This is probably a debate about removing it in a progressive way, which is proportionate to how happy they already are. So obviously, while we are taking away more happiness away from them than from other people, there are people who are inherently happier and can afford to take it. It's the same principle as proportionately taking more money from rich people. So CO out of the debate. 3 questions in this debate. First, how do we get people to help each other? Second, do other people have a claim to your happiness? And third, is the happiness that we get from this a legitimate sort of happiness that we ought to consider? 1, how do we get people to help each other? Opening opposition claims that these individuals will lose lose empathy when they feel that they're happy. What we told you coming from closing, I won't take a POI from, anyways, never mind, later. Firstly, what we told you coming from member of government, which had 0 response coming from closing opposition, was firstly, that in the status quo, you derive your happiness from the suppression of other individuals' happiness. That is, in the competition-based world that we live in, you get your happiness by 1, succeeding in a job interview where you get a job that other people can't get because you took it, or by marrying someone who other people now can't marry because you married that person. All of these things are sorts of competition that exist in the status quo, which means that the happiness that you derive from these things is inherently happiness that other people can no longer access. What we told you coming from Toby's speech on the counterfactual was that in our world, 1, at least you restore some level of happiness to those individuals by means of redistribution, but 2, and note that the reason why you got those things was arbitrary. It was based on things that you were born with or things that were a result of your surroundings. Things like 1, how smart you were born or how attractive you look, etc., etc. All of these things mean that 1, not only is it arbitrary as opening government tried to prove, it is also directly your fault that other people are unhappy because you were happy in a way that took that opportunity away from them. What we told you on the counterfactual was that now you have an incentive to make other people happy because you know that when they are less happy, more happiness will be taken away from you. This is the way that the progressive tax works in the status quo. Like when there's a bigger income gap between the rich and the poor, that often also means that there's a larger difference in the tax brackets, which means that the rich people will have more money taken away from them. That is to say that what happens under our side of the house is that these individuals create a direct incentive for the happiest people, aka the people with the most opportunity, to help other individuals at the end of the day. So we win opening opposition's issue about helping others. Second, do other people have a claim to your happiness? OG says, your happiness is arbitrary, therefore other people should get it and we should redistribute it. Opening opposition says, but no, you have a right to your own happiness at the end of the day. 1, we would argue that at the point where your happiness is taken away from others, then it is not a legitimate form of happiness that we ought to grant you over other people. That's why we don't accept slavery, because when you derive your happiness from the suffering of other individuals, i.e. the slaves, that is not a legitimate form of happiness, and we ought to make the slaves themselves happier at the end of the day. What we tell you is that under our side of the house, we do this because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Next, they say, but something is only good because people agree that it is good, and therefore because it is your happiness, you had a right to it. You didn't earn that happiness. It was given to you by your circumstances, and that was taken away from other people. Second, then they say, but the state cannot control your happiness because it is going to abuse you and Hitler, things like that. First response, we asked them the question, do you support the state ever doing anything? Had they deigned to take a POI, we would have asked them that. And the reason is because on their side of the house, it seems that they don't because the state is so abusive and corrupt, so we don't ever support any policy. But secondly then, note that most states, in the vast majority of cases where this ought to be debated, most states aren't as abusive and corrupt as opening opposition claims that they are. So this argument falls as well. Next, they say, but it's only meaningful when it's tied with action. 2 responses here. Firstly, we think that if this is true, that your happiness is only meaningful when tied with action. One, note that this is tautological.
Point.
That is to say, the argument literally is meaning comes from an action which makes you happy,
Point.
and being happy comes from deriving meaning. So there's no this is tautological and it ought to fall. But secondly, note then that that if it is true that your that your happiness is derived from meaning, then it is also true that we don't lose anything from removing your excess happiness because of the diminishing marginal returns, which were explained to you by my member of government. But we do gain something from making people who are already depressed significantly happier at the end of the day, and that ought to weigh more than that. But third, then lastly, they say that you make people less happy at the end of the day. Because it requires, and this was shared by closing opposition, the idea that you require a cycle of sad and happy experiences in order to have a frame of reference. Firstly, if it is true then that in the status quo, you require happy and sad experiences in order to be happy. Under our world, we skip the middleman. You no longer need the sad experiences in order to be happy. Under their side then, given the cycle, then that means that that you need to be sad in order to be happy. That means the end goal then is to be happy at the end of the day. So if we can skip the being sad and just give people direct happiness, then that is a good thing under their frame. But lastly, note then that under our side, we make people far more empathetic. We allow them to restore happiness to the people who they have caused to suffer. And third, because we create an incentive for people to help each other, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Deborah. Welcome the opposition.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Here.
Start.
Opening half in this debate cannot win because they assume that happiness is essentially good, and they assume that it should always be maximized, and they do not distinguish between different types of happiness. We are the only team that provides analysis about the experiential value of happiness, which varies situationally, and which is what actually provides meaning to the experience of being happy. And CG cannot win this debate either, because they are convinced that happiness is a commodity, and they do not analyze it as a human emotion, which means something to people. What I'm going to do in this speech is firstly engage with how this changes people's emotional well-being on an individual level, and then I'll talk about the kind of societal global happiness stuff. So, on changing emotional well-being, quickly to recap, what we told you was that this was uniquely bad because it took away excess happiness, and it was excess happiness that particularly mattered because that was what you remembered in the future when you looked back at the best moments of your life. That was what made particular experiences, for instance, getting married or falling in love or feeling really satisfied at the end of a long life, that was what made them feel meaningful. And there were important distinctions between those happinesses. The pathetic, frankly, response that we hear from the government bench is, oh, well, we are not taking all your happiness, we are simply taking the excesses. But that obviously misses the point. Our argument isn't that people are never happy. Our argument is that people are at a baseline stable level of happiness, and that completely takes away the value of being happy because it is removing the excess that is particularly bad. That is a unique piece of analysis in this debate. And so I think like this, because we are the first team to provide this nuance about the types of happiness and unhappiness, that clearly comes above the understandings of happiness that we heard throughout the rest of this debate. Let's quickly recap what those look like. We first told you that this specifically made certain moments completely dire. If you literally cannot feel happy when you get a lovely present from your mother or something, that is the kind of thing that you ought to remember in the future and that you no longer do. That was emotionally impacted at Sweeney and never received a sufficient non-dismissive response. That meant that getting fulfillment was impossible in the long run. Closing opposition tells the response about like, oh, well, maybe this is not a massive happiness. This is just a practical concern. Well, first of all, your opening government conceded that, so you're knifing. But second of all, again, this misses the point. The point is a stable level of happiness is not meaningful. That is what was not engaged within this debate. The second thing, completely unresponded to, that we tell you is this made people incapable of good sadness. Which is to say, for instance, if you feel guilty because you did a bad thing, you should feel guilty. You should not be placated because of that. Like, suppressing that was really bad. And that responded directly to what we heard at CG about like, oh, well, your boss should not feel happy for exploiting you. Well, your boss never felt bad about it if that boss was kept at a basic level of happiness. This changed the way people experience those negative emotions as well. I guess a different example would be you ought to feel sad at your grandma's funeral. Feeling numb at a baseline level of happiness was gruesome, and we would not support that. So we would say then it is particularly important that people do feel extremes of emotion. That is a natural human part of life, and no team engaged with it in the way that we did. Finally, though, we uniquely explain the unfairness of this impact, which was to say naturally happy people feel the loss of their happiness more because they are used to being happy than someone who is not particularly happy and gets a small increase in happiness. That person is already used to their level of happiness that experientially does not change their life that much. The response was like, oh, well, that person can just regain their happiness because they're a naturally happy person. But the point is, they will never be able to receive the heights of their happiness that they previously had because you start taking away their excesses. And that was particularly cruel because imagine being a generally happy person and then you feel that you can never reach those heights again. That was something that was just a really dire vision of the future for someone. Note that all of this responds to the quite poor analysis we hear from closing government about happiness being a commodity which has diminishing returns. Obviously not. Happiness is in fact perhaps the reverse. It is probably exponential, which is to say that when you felt euphoric, that was far more meaningful to you than a basic, stable, moderate level of happiness. That analysis occurred at Sweeney when he told you that you remembered those euphoric moments of your life far more, and it never received a response. That is disappointing. Finally, at Government Whip, we hear a point about because your choices disadvantage other people because you take away their potential spouses, you owe it to them to make them happy. But this is not a legitimate principle or a legitimate cause for other people's unhappiness. There is no direct causal link between you having someone fall in love with you and someone else being unable to find a partner. That is clearly a cumulative effect of lots of people finding happiness and that person not. Also, I'm sure they probably have some input in their romantic life. That clearly cannot win this debate for them. So at the end, because no team sufficiently engaged with what we told you about why it was particularly cruel to take away the excesses of emotion, why it was cruel to not let people feel their true feelings, we clearly come ahead on this point alone. I'll take a point of information from, let's go, opening call. Oh, sorry, I've clicked no thank you. Can you offer it again? Thanks.
Taken.
One-off instances of happiness like marriage and a gift cannot be like the debate because they don't occur in the majority of circumstance. It's about simply having a partner to derive happiness on a daily basis, and that's where the debate has to happen. How is that compared to individuals who are on the brink of suicide because they don't feel any happiness at all and do not feel any motivation to continue living on your side of the house?
Well, firstly, on the suicidality idea, I think it's just slightly ridiculous to try and make people feel happier via this. I think you obviously have other ways to make them feel happier, which are more meaningful and actually improve the kind of circumstances that probably made them feel that way. Secondly, with regards to the majority of time thing, again, this is just unresponsive to what we tell you about the excesses being particularly meaningful, which is to say maybe being mildly happy is important the majority of time, but it does not compare to the euphoria that you feel when you get married. And so even though that is a smaller time, that is not the metric we should use for judging happiness in this debate, obviously. All right. Well, let's talk about how you deal with like society and global happiness. The claim that OG kind of wants to hang their hat on, apart from, I think, unimpactful principles, is that the global poor is depressed, there are material reasons why they're unhappy, and so we should help them. This very achingly obviously works for our side, which is to say they never fix those material reasons why people are unhappy. So people still have huge rates of mortality and starve, but they feel happy about it, which is absurd. Opening opposition mentions this in a couple of extreme and unmechanized examples, but we give you a far stronger kind of version of this point, which is to say when people are generally badly off in life, perhaps not in the extremely dire circumstances that OO gave examples of, but when people are generally materially disadvantaged, all government in this debate can do is to placate those people. It is in fact completely legitimate misery. It is completely legitimate for people to feel unhappy, and that is what drove people to liberatory action in those instances. And that is important material in this debate because all of the grounds that opening government helpfully impacted for us will never be fixed under their side. The response that we get from closing government is just say, oh, well, would you support welfare enhancing policy from the government? But clearly that also enhanced people's lives, their circumstances, and their mortality rates. That was the meaningful change that we only got on our side. At the end of the debate, we have the most coherent understanding of what happiness is. We clearly win.
Right, thank you very much for that debate. I'm going to ask everybody to go back, or the debaters to go back to the presentation room